Hello, welcome to the session on learning strategies. Over the course of our study, we have seen that learning is a crucial cognitive process. When we look at the evolutionary growth of humans, learning has played a significant role in our survival, language and intellectual development. Humans innately are explorative and curious by nature, and seeking knowledge is primary for satisfying these innate needs. So far, we have seen multiple theories that explain how the process of learning takes place for an individual. Let us try to have an overview on some of the learning approaches. From these cases, try to understand the type of learning that is taking place. First, a teenager is being scolded by his senior professor for disturbing the class and is now usually quiet during the lectures. The answer over here is operant conditioning. Second, a child learning how to make an origami boat after watching his father make one during the monsoon season. The learning that is taking place over here is observational learning. Third, an employee discovering the solution to a workplace problem only after leaving the office and driving home. This kind of sudden solution is part of insight learning. Learning in general can be explicit and implicit in nature. There are two ways in which we can gather information for learning, and it can be in implicit or explicit form. Implicit learning is usually defined as acquisition of knowledge which takes place naturally, simply and without any conscious operation. This kind of learning will happen over a period of different episodes, such as in insight learning or observational learning. To give you an example, learning the native language by a toddler can be considered as an implicit form of learning where no conscious effort is taken by the toddler. This type of language acquisition will happen after spending time with his or her caregiver and imitating their language. While explicit learning is more of a conscious operation where the individual makes and tests hypotheses in a search for structure. Thus, explicit learning can be said as an intentional form of learning of information. To give an example, consider the same toddler. When he is enrolled in preschool, he may now have to learn English as part of academia. Here the toddler would have to attend classes, pay attention to the teacher in order to learn a language which is secondary to his mother tongue. Acquisition of knowledge is a complex phenomena, and while an individual strives to get more and more information, he or she may inexplicably end up using multiple learning strategies. In simple terms, a learning strategy is an individual's way of organizing and using a particular set of skills in order to learn content or accomplish other tasks more effectively and efficiently. In today's session, our focus would be on understanding these learning strategies and possible difficulties that may arise while using them. Most studies on learning strategies have emerged from extensive research done by educational psychologists in identifying which are the most efficient. We already know that learning takes place through various approaches like association or observation. However, when we take into consideration academic learning, the effort a student has to put forth in order to comprehend the associated or observed information depends not only on the learning approach, but also on the strategy he or she applies to retain what was learned. Hence, learning strategies become a crucial part of an individual's daily learning of his or her environment. Learning is a dynamic and consistent process for an individual, and hence the ability to retain what was learned and recall it later when necessary is important. Some common types of learning techniques that individuals end up using are practicing what is learned, rote learning, summarizing, making notes. But do these techniques have long-term effectiveness? Do they help an individual's intellectual stimulation? Educational psychologists have thus summed up learning strategies, a crucial aspect which is expected to be taught in academia. One of the recent forms of learning strategies has emerged from the concept of generative learning. Generative learning is a process of transforming incoming information, for example words and pictures, into usable knowledge, for example mental models or schemas. To give an example, a child is shown the alphabet A and an image of an apple, then the alphabet B and an image of a bat to explain English letters. This would help him make association of these alphabets, which is the new incoming information, to daily utilized items which are already existing knowledge to learn alphabets. In this definition, generative learning depends not only on how information is presented to learners, that is through instructional methods, but on how learners try to make sense of it based on previous knowledge. Fiorella and Mayer in 2015 suggested that genuine engagement in learning requires individuals to select, organize and integrate information. They labeled this process as generative learning. Generative learning is based upon the theory that learning process depends upon the memory and knowledge that already exists in our mind. When new data is integrated into the long-term memory, it becomes part of our understanding. Let us put it another way. Students generate learning by attending to relevant material, organizing material into coherent cognitive structures and connecting new information with knowledge stored in the long-term memory. The selecting, organizing, integrating, it is SOI model of generative learning given by Fiorella and Mayer is shown in the figure. According to this SOI model, meaningful learning has three primary cognitive processes. At first, the learner has to select the necessary and relevant sensory information in order for further conscious processing. This information can be in the form of visual, auditory or other forms of sensory data. Next, the learner must organize the selected sensory information into comprehensible mental representations by building relevant connections in the working memory. This is the stage where the learner tries to make sense of the information by identification and understanding various characteristics of that information. And lastly, it is the third element, the learner integrates the organized information with existing relevant information stored in the long-term memory. Let us consider an example while learning to solve a mathematical problem like 2 plus x is equal to 5. The student begins by focusing or selecting the information to be solved, followed by organizing this equation by identification of the numbers that are written, the operation of addition to be used, and finally integrating with previously learnt information on how to rearrange this equation to get the x value. That is, x can be equal to 5 minus 2, which will lead them to find the answer as 3. However, the learner can use two ways to reach this answer. One is to rearrange the numericals mentioned above as learnt in school, or keep counting from 2 till the student reaches the count of 5, which he may have learnt by personal experience. Both ways seem to give the correct answer, but it is also dependent on the student's memory and the approach to the problem. Thus, the SOI learning model is strongly interconnected with memory functions. This suggests that learning strategy will also be dependent upon memory functioning of the student. The SOI model also recognizes the important role of metacognition, which is an individual's conscious awareness and control over their own cognitive processes like perception, attention to detail and motivation, which is influenced by an individual's interest, goals, beliefs about the information to be learnt. Fiorella and Mayer described 8 learning strategies that support generative learning. Let us look at them in some detail. This first strategy is learning by summarizing. Summarizing typically involves concisely stating the main ideas from a content in your own words. Summarizing breaks down a complex set of information into easy to read handy notes and makes an outline of key elements from a pool of content the learner is exposed to. A perfect example would be of what you, who is viewing this session as a learner, might be doing, that is to take summary notes of this lecture. To use the SOI model as a reference, think of yourself as selecting relevant information from this session, organizing it into an outline on the topic being taught today, and then integrating it with maybe your prior knowledge and adding new material or examples of your own. Though summarizing may seem to be an effective strategy to learn, it may be adequate in only situation where the information pool is rather short or not highly complex in nature. That is, summarizing a lesson plan or a lecture would be easier than summarizing a whole book or a mathematical problem. The second learning strategy is mapping. It involves creating flowchart, concept map or graphic organization of information to simplify complex material into quick readable mental images. The mapping process usually includes the use of nodes, which are ovals or rectangles, and lines which connect these nodes to display some connection. If you have to explain your family tree to someone, instead of verbally explaining the relationships, it would be much easier to create a flowchart which starts from your grandparents to your current generation. Mapping has 2 types. First is a concept map, which is a network of nodes to explain key concepts and lines with verbal description written on them to state the relations between those nodes. Let us take this image for an example. However, this type can be used for a smaller set of information. The next type is a knowledge map, which is usually used for larger data representation. This kind of map will include key concepts, parts, subparts or even characteristics of the information. As you can see, the field of psychology has multiple domains that have been covered in this course like sensation, perception, language, memory, learning, etc. Now, under learning, we have seen types like classical, which has characteristic principles like generalization, extinction and spontaneous recovery. Then, another type, operant conditioning, which again has subparts of reinforcement and punishment, followed by observation learning and insight learning. Similarly, we can keep extending the nodes for other domains too. This final map then becomes a graphical representation of the complete knowledge we may have gained through this course at the end. Evidence has suggested that teaching children how to map information since early years in their education can help them be better academic performers than those who have not learnt or used this technique. Isn't this interesting? Now let us look at our next learning strategy, which is drawing. Though this strategy seems to look like an easy one, this is by evidence a strong aid to retain the learnt information. Drawing as a learning method simply includes making an illustration to complement a written piece of work or to explain a set of instructions and connections. For example, if you are currently reading about the human brain and its various parts and functions, drawing a diagram of the brain and labeling its parts and writing their functions beside them seems like a good idea, does it not? Well, you are right, because the chances of you retaining the drawn image in your memory is stronger than the verbal information you are reading. However, one shortcoming of this technique is that the act of drawing could create confusion, fatigue or disinterest if the learner has to focus on the tedious task of drawing rather than the content of the lesson. That being said, the benefit of drawing has been found with elementary school students, high school students and even college students to better grasp certain verbal material. Our fourth learning strategy is imagining. In learning by imagining, the learner creates mental images that show the content of a material. The learner creates a mental image for a piece of work on how it will look or happen. According to the SOI model of generative learning, the conversion of text to image prompts the learner to select relevant information from the material, show its organization in the form of mental images, and maybe use prior knowledge to clarify the meaning of the text and its relation to the image. Let us take the same example of understanding the structure of the brain which we spoke of in the strategy of drawing. The learner can read the paragraph on the brain and can now imagine the consequent parts and functions by making a mental image of the brain. Unlike drawing as a strategy, there is no form of distraction caused by the tediousness of drawing a diagram of the brain on a paper. Here, the flexibility offered by imagining the content rather than drawing helps the learner to be more efficient in his learning, and the information may be retained longer as it is self-generated compared to the image drawn by some external author. From the SOI model, integration of information would be stronger in imagining than drawing. However, it is possible that the act of imagining could create ambiguity if the learner is confused what to imagine. That is, if the text does not mention the structure of the brain clearly, it would be really hard for the learner to imagine the brain. So, clear directions may be required for imagining content. Now that we have understood 4 learning strategies, let us take a simple activity. Please keep a pen and paper with you for writing down your inputs. From the content that you have seen so far in this session, can you use any one of the learning strategies to make this lesson plan easy to understand? Please write down the strategy and try implementing it as explained earlier. What choice did you make? Was it summarizing the content into simple sentences or keywords? Was it mapping the content into a flowchart? Or was it drawing the SOI model and then mapping the 4 strategies into a spider diagram? Of course, there is no right or wrong learning strategy in this case. Sometimes you may have to revisit the information in order to use any specific form of strategy, and sometimes you may end up using more than one strategy. As a learner, you need to keep in mind that the strategy that helps you retain the information in the long term while making sense and which also aids generative learning is the best for that content. The next strategy is called self-testing. It is also called as retrieval based learning and mainly involves recall of all the information the learner knows through mapping and writing. This typically involves quizzes, tests, practice questions about previously learnt material. In generative learning theory, self-testing lets the learner determine the most relevant knowledge, explain the details in their own words, organize the knowledge by making inferences, and incorporate information with pre-existing knowledge during the explanation. Also, taking practice tests lead to more persistent learning outcomes than merely restudying the material. This is especially true when we take examples of preparing for any formal examination like the 10th grade or the 12th grade board exam or competitive exam like UPSC or CET. Self-testing in the form of practice test help the learner to apply the learnt knowledge in the most accurate and relevant way. This strategy also assists to streamline their thought process on what exactly is expected them to retrieve. In a study done by Rodiger and Karpik in 2006, students were asked to read short text passages about the sun or about dolphins and then take a practice free recall test on the same passage. Now let us look at the learning strategy of self-explaining. Self-explaining involves explaining the content of a lesson to oneself during learning. Self-explaining is most effective when students select the most important information from the content and restate it in their own words, which helps them associate with the content more coherently. Self-explaining can simply also be elaborating on the hows and whys of a concept where the learner may break down the information with examples or simple words for better understanding or easy recall in the future. Similar to self-testing, here the learner selects relevant information, organizes it in his own words while making inferences and integrates with the pre-existing knowledge during explanations. We have come to the seventh learning strategy, which is teaching. It basically involves explaining material with the goal of helping others learn. Teaching can look similar to self-explaining, but it differs on the ground that it is intended for others. Another purpose of teaching is to help others in learning. Teaching is also unique because in addition to the act of explaining, it also involves other factors that can contribute to learning, such as preparing to teach and interacting with others. Here, the learner is also extra cautious on how information is shared, thus making this strategy also evaluative on the learner's own knowledge. And lastly, our eighth learning strategy is enacting. Learning by enacting involves engaging in task relevant movements during learning, such as by manipulating objects or performing gestures in coordination with the lesson content. For example, the teacher may request the students to enact a play of Shakespeare that they have just read in the class. When the learners enact, they perform gestures or manipulate things relevant to the knowledge to be learnt. It is also generative learning technique because students choose the actions to perform, organize the details through actions and incorporate new knowledge with pre-existing knowledge during the process. Enacting is a unique strategy because it involves using behavioral activity to incorporate learning of content. We have so far seen 8 learning strategies which can be adopted by learners to increase their efficiency to acquire knowledge and implement it. These strategies are also recommended to educators while imparting knowledge to students for increased student performance. Now moving to the last part of our session, which is focused on the difficulties faced while using the previously learned strategies. Studies suggest 4 possible reasons why learners may have issues in applying effective learning strategies. The first is illusion of comprehension, which means being unaware of what one does not know. This also means the gaps between one's knowledge or skills and the expectations of the instructor. For example, you believe that you have understood the concept taught by the teacher, but in reality the comprehension, that is the generative learning, has not taken place. This leads the learner to have difficulty reproducing the content when asked or required. Second, ineffective study habits. Simply highlighting text in books, rereading text without attempting to make sense, rote learning, and sometimes over-reliance on Google can be considered as ingrained but ineffective study habits. Third, lack of foundational knowledge. This inhibits the ability to make analogies and connections about the newly acquired knowledge and hinders generative learning. And lastly, ability attributions. Ability attribution such as telling oneself, I am just no good at this, or I won't be able to learn this, or I am not smart enough, impedes the effort to learn. Putting oneself down can lead to demoralization, and this directly affects the learning process. This can be especially true during times when the learner is stressed or has evaluation exams coming up or needs to finish under strict deadlines. Thus, having a calm and peaceful state of mind is equally important. With this, we have come to the conclusion of our session. In today's module, we saw the concept of learning strategies, their importance, and the need for generative learning. We also understood the 8 learning strategies that the learners can implement for effective learning to take place and possible hindrances in utilizing these strategies. I hope the session was interesting and that you all would be now curious to apply these strategies in your daily knowledge seeking. Thank you.